Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another video. It's your host, Rising Oblivion. Today, guys, I wanted to talk about something that's kind of been on my mind for quite some time, and that is regarding what might happen to the rest of Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I know a lot of people from the fan base really are not liking the fact that they're bringing out DLCs and things like that. Instead, they should be working on something like Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, and I fully understand that. And I definitely think that is what I would rather have instead of having a bunch of DLCs and things like that come out. But, however, I don't think that's what's going to end up happening here. I think they are doing a little bit of Final Fantasy 15 work here when it comes to backtracking and sort of doing separate DLCs for past characters. Something like Yuffie, for instance. Now, I'm not super upset about these types of things. I really liked Final Fantasy VII Remake, and honestly, I think this Yuffie DLC is going to be really cool. Kind of sucks that it's locked to having to be on the PS5. Considering I don't have a PS5 yet, haven't really found a reason to get it yet. There's a couple of games on there, but I like to have a good handful or more of games on that console that are exclusive to it before I even try to, take the jump into that. But I wanted to talk about what future DLCs might be like for something like Final Fantasy VII Remake going on in the future here. And from what it looks like, they might end up doing some type of maybe season pass system or a episodic type of deal where they're doing these separate individual character DLCs similar to what they did with Final Fantasy 15. They had episode Prompto, episode Ignis, Gladios, stuff like that. Well, we have this, which is technically called episode Yuffie, but that's just what the fanbase is calling it. We don't actually think that, Final Fantasy themselves and people at Square Enix don't call this episode Yuffie, really. They just call it the Yuffie DLC. Even if you look at the PlayStation Store and check the stuff out for that, it just says it's the Yuffie DLC or the new Yuffie added on story episode or whatever you want to call it. They don't actually call it episode Yuffie like they did with Final Fantasy 15 with the different episodes there, but we might end up seeing something like this in the future if they go down the route with Final Fantasy 15, and we know that there were characters within Final Fantasy VII Remake that didn't fully get touched on. Like this, for example, Red 13, he was there in Final Fantasy VII Remake, however, he was not playable, and it really did not talk a ton about how he got there. Now, for the original players of the game, you might know how, Red 13 gets there, what's happened to him, this whole story with that, but we might end up seeing something in the future similar to how we have Yuffie here, but we might end up seeing something like a Red 13 DLC. And I know it's bad for them to sort of backtrack and have all these DLCs like this and stuff like that. Either they were going to do a DLC for Red 13, or later on, maybe within Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, they'll have flashback cutscenes or something like that to help express that. Hopefully it's not all within that mobile game that's going to be coming out that's supposed to be sort of wrapping the story up until the point to where we get here, but we might end up seeing something with Red 13, possibly before Cloud ever even, catches up and finds Red 13. We might end up getting a DLC about him sometime here in the future, maybe somewhere along the end of this year, or maybe after the Yuffie DLC or something like that. I mean, the order really doesn't matter, and we really don't know that exactly. And we know that Zack does appear at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it would be kind of cool if we also could get a DLC for him. So Red 13 DLC, maybe a DLC on Zack, a DLC on Yuffie, and possibly even maybe a DLC on Aerith. It wouldn't surprise me if all the characters that are kind of out and around end up getting separate DLCs in the future. Possibly even with the rest of the people within the crew within Final Fantasy VII Remake that we don't know a ton about, or where they went, or what they're doing. Those potentially could also be DLCs in the future, which I don't 100% agree with. Like I said, I would much rather them have, some time to work on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. However, there are separate studios at Square Enix. Just because they are having a couple DLCs come out doesn't mean it's directly from the team that's working on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. We don't necessarily know that, where the work's divvied up, who's working on what. Was the HD remix for technically like the PS5 version, like the, I guess, Intergrade is what you want to call it. I'm calling it Remix because that's how all of Square Enix games end up at some point or another, but is that done by the exact same team? We don't quite know that. So a lot of people that are talking about, hey, them doing all these other things for Final Fantasy VII Remake is taking away from Final Fantasy Remake Part 2. We don't actually know that. The team over there themselves might have separate groups working on different things. Even within the same studio there at Square Enix, different people could be working on different things. Just because we see some different things coming out for Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't quite mean that. However, even though it might hinder the experience or hinder how long it takes for them to make Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, I still do like these DLCs. I think they're cool. I would like for them to be free, like the Yuffie DLC. However, you gotta buy a PS5, so you could say that technically this might be the most expensive DLC, kind of, if you have to buy a PS5 for it. Not really, but kind of. You have to buy a whole PS5 in order to experience this DLC, and from what we know, they have not said anything about it for coming to PS4. There's a good chance it's not going to be coming to PS4, judging with how Final Fantasy 16 has such hard ties into Sony. Final Fantasy right now and Square Enix is locked in when it comes to Sony. So what might we see for these DLCs in the future? Potentially, what I am predicting is we might end up seeing something like a Season Pass bundled together, possibly. We know the Yuffie DLC is going to be free, but there's no way they're going to keep pumping out a bunch of free DLC unless they're in some type of contract with Sony that allows them to do that. Square Enix is going to want to profit from this at some way or another. So we might end up seeing something where we end up getting some type of Season Pass, potentially for maybe other characters like Red 13, maybe certain bits with Zack before he ends up showing up there at that final ending cutscene. Maybe they'll save that for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. It would make more sense for them to kind of go into that. Where we left off with Final Fantasy VII Remake, probably where Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 will continue off of. So it sort of makes sense with the story. So maybe not a Zack DLC, or maybe a Zack DLC at some point or another. And potentially maybe even something like with Aerith, knowing what she did while she was away or before she met Cloud, different things like that. Different setting up of the stages of what's going to happen in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. That seems to be what they're doing with these types of DLCs, because there's so many characters in Final Fantasy VII, just the original game, that didn't quite get touched upon in the remake. So in order to get us prepared for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, that is what seems to be happening with all of these DLCs and the phone things and all this stuff. And don't even get me started about the Battle Royale, but Jesus. They are getting all of these different things ready for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, so I would not be surprised if we end up seeing more DLCs. These character DLCs bring more people into the party and stuff like that for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. The phone game catches us up with a story, different things with Zack, knowing what's going on with the rest of the people in the world, what they're doing, where they are, how they got there, Aerith's relationships with other people, the connections and the ties we have with other characters. All of those things need to be pretty much set and put on the stage for us to completely understand what Final Fantasy VII is. For them to leave certain things out means we're leaving out entire chunks of the story that were in the original game, which is why I think after the success of Final Fantasy VII Remake that I think Square Enix finally realized, okay, we need to actually include everything in this. That's why they're doing the phone game, that's why they're doing these story DLCs, so I would not be surprised if we end up seeing more of this in the future, because they have a lot of ground to cover and they have a lot of things that they're going to have to try and incorporate in order to make Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 sort of make sense and have all the characters and all the details needed for it in the future. But I think it's going to wrap up this video, guys. Let me know, do you like this idea? Would you like a Season Pass? I know I would rather have Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, but I'm not sure how they're going to incorporate these things. And like I said, I'm just talking about this, speculating about this. I don't necessarily agree with these types of things that they are doing, but it is what it is. It's Square Enix at the end of the day. You know, what can you expect, I guess? It is what it is. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's got its pros and cons, really. But let me know down in the comment section below, what do you think about this? Do you think this is a good idea? Do you think this is a bad idea? I don't know. I'm kind of torn on it. At the same time, I don't really know. I think eventually I was going to buy a PS5, but it's sort of hard for me to fully justify everything that's going on with Square Enix and how they're sort of leading this stuff. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, so you always can be, you know, there whenever I have a new video come out. Like the bell so it actually gives you notifications, because I stream on here sometimes when I go live, play different games. I do Final Fantasy sometimes, Persona, stuff like that, and you'll always know whenever I have a new video come out, and I'll keep you informed on the latest stuff when it comes to Final Fantasy VII Remake, Persona, all the different stuff. But thanks for this video, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.